Well, Tom, it's been 3 weeks now, I think, since we've last even done one of these together. I appreciate Cody sitting in for you last week. I think you did a great job.
Our listeners got in my place. They got both beauty and brains. So I'm really grateful to Cody for sitting in.
So there's a lot of ways places I could take that. I'm just gonna skip over those comments, but it is good to see you. I know you are still you're still fighting this off a little bit, and we're still
Yeah.
kind of trying to get to a point where you're feeling good and having the energy. But I'm really glad that we were able to at least do this together again today. The last 2 weeks have been a little awkward. We've done so many. This is our 79th episode, and we've done
It's
so many
amazing,
of
isn't
these
it?
together. The
Yep.
last 2 weeks have been really interesting, and wouldn't you know that of all things that are gonna keep us from doing this, it happened to be COVID.
Yeah. Well, COVID has pummeled me, and I will say to any of the skeptics out there who think it's not real. I don't know if there's still those people or not, but it's a real thing. And I will tell our listeners if they're interested. I did choose about 5 months ago, 5 to 6 months ago. I got both doses of the Pfizer vaccine. I have a long history going all the way back to when I was a kid. I every year I had bad problems with bronchitis, sometimes pneumonia, respiratory infections. And so I took the vaccine hoping to ward off any serious respiratory problems. And I got COVID. It's been pretty bad. Now, my understanding is that the vaccine mitigates the symptoms. It makes it less severe typically if you get COVID after being vaccinated, and it's still been pretty rough for me. I'm still struggling. In fact, I'm going to ask all of our members here to for a little grace because I might be coughing and sniffing around a little bit during this podcast. I still have some congestion going on in my chest.
It's really interesting because you do have this whole conversation of how does the vaccine help and how does it not, and what type of vaccine is it? Should it be called a vaccine? I mean, I
Yeah.
to the best of my understanding, it's very similar to the flu vaccine. They
Hmm.
they identify what the strain is out there, and they try to help your body. The vaccine is intended to try to help your body fight it off. It seems like this thing is changing so much and so quickly that you just wonder, you could have gotten a vaccine that treats one variant
Right.
of COVID, and you got something entirely different.
I saw a meme yesterday on social media said, "Wait, it can't be is it Omicron? Omicron is the new variant.
Yeah,
It can't be
Omicron.
Omicron season yet. I still have my Delta uh, decorations up."
Well, and then there's that whole other conversation, the fact that they skipped, they do these by the Greek alphabet,
Right.
and they skipped G, um, because they didn't want to offend the head of the Chinese Communist Party.
Ah, they could have called it Gamma.
Well, I think we already got there, or maybe that's later in the alphabet. I don't know,
Right.
but we've gone through so many of these, and at one point, my position, my belief, we're gonna have to figure out how we're gonna live with this and how we can all continue to be happy and healthy and productive in our lives, knowing that it's out there, just like the flu is
Yeah.
out there and just like other things, because whoever made this, and I think we all agree this is something man made at this point. They unleashed something on the world that's not going away anytime soon.
That's not been proven, at least not in the public realm, but certainly there's much evidence that is pointing in that direction. That this virus came from a lab that was doing gain of function research. So the thing that's tearing through my body right now, and many others too, very likely was engineered to be worse, to be more dangerous, more lethal than it already was in nature. And here's the part that really rubs me is I've been, yeah, lying at home sucking down bottles of Mucinex and Tylenol and fighting fevers and all that. What makes this really difficult is knowing that this very likely was funded with my money and
Yeah.
your money against our will, right? We didn't choose this. We didn't ask for our money to go to this kind of research. It was taken from us in the form of taxes and then ends up through appropriations bills going to the NIH and bureaucrats like Anthony Fauci are sending big bags of money over to the Wuhan laboratory in China.
Yeah. Well, for anybody who wants to do some more research on that, I will point to Senator Rand Paul.
Yeah,
He's released a lot of I mean, he's one of the few medical doctors in in the United States government in an elected office.
right.
And he's done some really good research and some provided some really good information. I've enjoyed, I don't know if enjoyed the right, but I valued going through some of that and seeing what he's talking about.
I will say before we move on, I just a little, just a friendly reminder to our members of the Vino and Veritas Society. This virus is a real thing, and COVID is a real sickness, and it can be bad. I'm not terribly old and relatively healthy. I'm in pretty good shape. I have good, blood pressure and low cholesterol and all those sorts of things. And I've been vaccinated, and it's really taken a toll on me. And I'm not out of the woods yet. So do whatever you can to really, take care of yourselves and protect yourselves. Stay healthy.
That's the most important thing. Make the choice, do the research and make the choice to stay
Hmm.
healthy, and there are the things that are the right things to do, right, that have nothing to do with government mandates or anything else, and those are things like making sure you're washing your hands enough and making sure you're taking vitamins and that you're doing what you can to stay relatively healthy.
Yep, I think that's right. Well, on another topic, Dave, I think it's a holiday season. At least it's a holiday season for you, right? Happy Hanukkah.
Thank you. It is. It's funny. I hear Happy Hanukkah all the time. If you go to Israel, it's very rarely talked about. It's considered a minor holiday in Israel, and it's not this great thing, this big deal there. But it is here in part because of Christmas. But this year, particularly, or in particular, I look back on it and I think it's almost a celebration of the world's first recorded supply chain shortage. and and with Joe Biden in office, that's such a great
Yeah.
it's such a great reminder um, of how things work. But
There were some Jews a long time ago dealing with something similar, like a bunch of ships sitting off the coast of California.
well, not quite. But they were also not living in a capitalist free market regime
Yeah.
where if you knew somebody needed something, somebody else could go provide it for you. It was all being provided by the government, by the king at the time.
Hmm.
For those who don't know the Hanukkah story, a little bit of background. I think it's fairly interesting that most people know Hanukkah's 8 nights, and a lot of people know why it's 8 nights, but there's a whole lot more to the story. Hanukkah, in a lot of ways, reminds me of the American Revolution. The Syrians had come into Israel and had said, "You can't practice Judaism anymore. We are trying to rid the world of Judaism," and they desecrated the temple on the
Right.
Temple Mount, which was sort of the main religious area of Israel, and they desecrated it. They put up new statues of their gods, and they told Jews, you can't practice Judaism anymore. And their goal was to exterminate Judaism from the world. And this was around 200 BC.
Hmm.
So we're maybe 70 years before the Romans decided to go
Hmm.
in and the Roman Jewish wars began. Another conversation for another time. But the Syrians came in. They started doing this, and this little group of ragtag rebels who wanted to defend their right
Yeah.
to religious freedom to practice Judaism ran off into the forest, ran and hid, and they were the family that sort of organized this were the Maccabees,
Hmm.
and there was this guy Judah Maccabee who was one of the five sons who became sort of the commander of this almost militia.
Right.
Israel didn't really have an army at the time; they weren't really prepared to fight, and so these guys ran off, and it was just a small group of people.
these were citizen soldiers, right? This was not some professional, well-armed, well-disciplined, you know, army. This
Right.
was these were farmers and neighbors and friends deciding to band together and protect their way of life.
Just like the guys who ended up going and fighting alongside Washington during the Revolution.
Yeah,
And they did it with
yeah.
their own weapons, and they went out into the woods and they started training and they taught each other and they developed strategy. And over the course of 3 years, this small, tiny fraction of the Jewish population in Israel decided to fight back against the Syrians. And over the course of 3 years, they won. The story of Hanukkah is that when they won, they relit a candelabra that was in front of the temple to sort of
Hmm.
declare or show their victory. And when they did that, there was supposed to be enough oil to last one day. The oil ended up lasting 8 days. It's a perceived miracle of God, and so the supply chain shortage. They needed oil to last in the to rededicate the temple, and it lasted 8 days,
Right.
even though it should have only lasted one. So that's the supply chain shortage joke. But the story in and of itself, I think, is really interesting, and I think it lends to an interesting conversation for us to have about choices. Right? You had thousands of citizens in Israel, or tens of thousands of citizens in Israel at the time, and only a very, very small percentage made the choice to go out and actually fight and organize themselves and fight.
I wanted to add just a quick sort of deep theological point. The story of Hanukkah goes right to the heart of a subject that was really a lifelong study of my teacher, Harry Jaffa, his teacher, Leo Strauss. They often refer to it as the theological political problem. And the whole topic really revolves around the uniqueness of the Hebrew God, the Hebrew concept of God prior to the Hebrews, prior to the Jews. The world is very much a either a you could describe it as a pagan world or even a pantheistic world. People believe that the stars were gods and the moon was a god, and there were all these different gods, and they were always
Mhm.
fighting and quarreling. And what makes the Hebrew God really unique, what makes the Hebrews unique in world history, is they come along and they declare one God that is the totality of everything. He is the beginning, He is the middle, He is the end. He is what He will be. There is nothing beyond Him, nothing outside of Him, and therefore all other gods are false gods. Prior to the Hebrew God in the ancient world, when cities or tribes will go to war, they all worship, they all pray to their own gods, usually the ancestral gods of their towns, praying for victory in battle and these sorts of things. And the losers usually viewed their own defeat as a defeat of their gods, right? They thought, well,
Right.
the gods of the other army, the other was stronger and ours were weaker. But there was no idea that these gods were fictional, that they didn't exist. And if you take the idea of the unique oneness, the radical oneness of the Hebrew God, then it means all other gods must be false gods. They're not really gods. They're myths, they're
Right.
illusions, they're lies. And that's what made the Hebrews so problematic from a political point of view, because wherever they went, any kingdom, any tribe, clan, the governing powers there were usually propped up. They were
Mhm.
legitimized by the local religion, by the local gods, the local priests. And along come these, this ragtag group of Jews saying, we don't even acknowledge that those are real. There's only one God, and it's our God.
Right.
And to profess that, to advocate for that in the ancient world, to make that choice, to stand up and say, I believe there is one God and only one God, and all other gods are really lies, sophistries. That in itself was a daring, bold, radical declaration in the ancient world.
And think about, I mean, to kind of put a bow around that, if you really think about it, when the Greeks and the Romans went to war, the Syrians and the Greeks and the Romans all fought each other, and you had all these different battles among those people. They weren't saying my God of war is real and your God of war is not. They were saying my God of
Right.
war is stronger than your God of war. My God of
Exactly.
war is more powerful than yours, and I'm going to show you that because by defeating you. And what you're
Exactly.
saying is the Jews were saying there is no God of war. There's just God.
Right.
And it totally does. It diminishes those other religions in that way of saying you guys think you have a God of war and you think you have a God of love and you have a God of
Hmm.
the sea and a God of the sky and a God of the stars and the moons. No, you just have God. And you're right. I think that is where it became such a problem for so many of these other peoples. They weren't necessarily countries, but they were empires. Whether it was the Syrians or the Romans or the Babylonians or whoever else, you had these empires that were all based. The other thing that was interesting about what you were just saying was so many of them believed that those gods were represented through live human beings, right? that
Right.
that you could actually have, this is our God and he's come back in this form and he is actually going to lead our army. Our God of war is this human being who will actually go fight. And the Jews are saying he's not a god. We're not going to bow
Right.
down to him. Our God is all around us, but he's not in your taken form in some human form.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Think of the way that the Egyptians viewed Pharaoh as literally a god. Literally, he was a god from the point of view of the Egyptians, or many Romans viewed Caesar, and some Caesars viewed themselves, right, as an actual god.
Yeah.
And that radical oneness, the uniqueness of the Hebrew God. I mean, you can't even represent the Hebrew God in speech or in writing, much less with a person, right? To
Right.
say this person is actually God. And for those who are of a philosophic bent, I'll just toss out a suggestion here, and that is, if you compare Plato's concept of the idea of the good, it's the radical oneness that makes the universe whole and
Hmm.
intelligible and one. The idea of the good in Plato and the Hebrew concept of the uniqueness of God, there's a huge overlap. They have very much in common, and both of them don't lend support to competing political powers. When you have multiple governments among multiple different people, this creates a very real political problem in the Western world. In a way, this is one of the great challenges of modern political philosophy, is to come to grips with this idea of radical monotheism. There's one God, and yet we see around the world many different governments, different kings,
Hmm.
different kinds of regimes. And what is it that can make a political regime legitimate if it's not the particular ancestral gods of a city, or of a community? What is it? And the wonderful news for us is it led thinkers like John Locke to the idea of consent. The consent of the governed is something that can actually make a government legitimate, while keeping intact this notion of the radical oneness of the world, of God, of the universe. These are some kind of deep, heady waters, Dave. I didn't know we were going to this direction this morning.
I'm just glad you were up for it. Um, Well, I do want to go back to the Maccabees though for a minute and the
Sure.
choice that they made to go out into the woods and say, we talk about the revolutionary soldiers, George Washington's army. That they were fighting the most powerful army in the world in the history of the world.
Yeah.
Those Maccabees were doing the same thing. The Syrians at the time were the most powerful army in the world, and they were there to eliminate these people. It
Yeah.
wasn't just a you need to bow to us and you need to acknowledge our gods and you can't just say this is a monotheistic world. You have to acknowledge our gods. They wanted to murder them. They wanted to drive them into the sea and say you're going to drown all of you and kill all of you and you're gone. And this
Yeah.
little ragtag bunch made a choice. And it reminds me of something my dad used to say to me a lot when I was growing up. And it's something that's always stuck with me. And I think it's one of the best lessons I've ever learned. And that is that life is full of choices. and every choice we make has a consequence. But he
Hmm.
framed it in this sense that consequences aren't necessarily bad things. Consequences are simply
Right.
reactions, or it's Newtonian in a sense, right? For every
Right.
action there's an equal and opposite reaction. The consequence is the reaction to whatever happens as a result of your choices, and they can be good or they can be bad, right?
Yep.
If a person or a politician makes a choice and it gives more freedom to people, it can have a positive
Hmm.
consequence on everybody. At the same time, what we're seeing with Joe Biden as an example is making this choice to eliminate pipelines throughout the United States. And as he eliminates pipelines, he's raising gas prices, and he's hurting our economy, and he's causing inflation, and he's directing the Fed to print more money, and they're causing inflation. And those are negative consequences. But at the end of the day, we need to be good about thinking through consequences. And I think that's what the Maccabees did. I think that's what the Revolutionary War soldiers did in particular, and maybe the one of the most impactful, I think is probably the right word. One of the most impactful choices that has happened in the history of the world was those 56 men sitting around the Declaration of Independence and making a choice to
Yeah.
sign it. And they
Yeah.
knew there were going to be consequences. And those consequences could go either way, right? You could have the positive consequence of this declaration is going to help lead the Revolutionary War soldiers, help lead Washington and his men to victory and
Right.
drive the British back across the Atlantic, or we lose and we all just committed treason and we're all going to be
Right.
hung in the
Right.
middle of town.
Right, bunch of executions going on. Boy, you've put your finger on a quite a topic here. This idea of choices and consequences. This might be one of the most important topics for modern Americans to be thinking about. I mean, it's clearly true in the political realm. It's also true for the individual. And that simple lesson that each of us, we are free to make choices, all kinds of choices about big subjects, little subjects, and every time we make a choice, there are going to be consequences.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Sometimes some consequences are unforeseen. We don't expect a certain consequence, or some consequences are beyond our control. A whole lot of consequences are within our control. We can, within a realm of predictability and knowability, we can know what kind of consequences are going to flow from different types of choices. And in a way, this is the whole foundation of classical education, the classical notion of virtue. If you
Yes.
read through Aristotle's Ethics, it's really thinking through what are the consequences that are desirable to you. What kind of life do you want? Do you want to be a happy, whole, complete person with a full, good life? Then you're going to want certain consequences, and his teaching in virtue is getting used to, getting accustomed, getting habituated to making the kinds of choices that result in the kinds of consequences that are more conducive to a happy, good, fulfilling life.
Yep.
And in a way, where we are today in modern progressive America, to a large extent, we have millions of fellow citizens who want to make any choice they feel like making at the moment, and they don't want the consequences.
Right.
They think, some subsidy program is going to save them from their consequences, or some medical science technology is going to cure whatever problem was created by their choices, rather than taking ownership of their choices and thinking through what are the consequences most likely to flow from the choices that I make. That's true at the individual level, and it's certainly true at the political level, at the level of policy. And we have just done a terrible job for decades of making choices about public policies that if we just thought about it for 10 seconds, we would know that these policies are going to lead to bad consequences. We adopt policies that incentivize corruption, that incentivize laziness and dependency, that incentivize irresponsibility, and yet we jump to these policies In some cases, we're shamed into it. We're told we're a bad person if we don't support these things, or we just don't really think about it. And we make these choices, and we've created this kind of mess of a modern world that we have right now.
I think there's some interesting things when you really dig into the individual choices that we're all making. I mean, look at the number of individual choices that have had that people are making every minute of every day lately, and many of which have become very public, right? I mean, let's just talk about what's been in the news over the last 2 weeks. Kyle
Hmm.
Rittenhouse, right? He
Hmm.
made a choice. A lot of people agree with it and a lot of people disagree with it, but at the end of the day, he made a choice, and he had to analyze the consequences of that choice before he made it. We now have a trial going on with Ghislaine Maxwell, and her whole situation about helping Jeffrey Epstein. This is a
Yeah.
woman who made a choice to
Yeah.
help a somebody or help other people rape young women,
Yeah.
and arguably young men. I mean, what went through her head when she was making that choice? We have choices. All of us are making choices about how do we want to approach the vaccine? How do we want to approach COVID? And do we want to live in fear? And I think that in and of itself, are you going to live in fear of COVID, or are you going to think through it and decide, here's how I can best keep my health and at the
Hmm.
same time be a healthy, happy, and productive person in the world? And all of these choices are becoming so critical in our lives. And what you talked about that was so important was we're no longer teaching children how to be analytical in a way of understanding what are the consequences of my choices, what choices
Hmm.
do I have to make, and what are the consequences of those. And I think that's really led to a lot of our problems in our country today. I would venture to argue that one of the biggest issues we're facing, to the point that people, I talked about fear a minute ago. People are so afraid of making a bad decision, or making a bad choice that leads to a bad consequence, that they've gotten to the point where that is why they want government taking care of them. They're so
Yeah.
ill-equipped and unprepared to actually make a decision and analyze what the potential consequences are, good or bad, that they would rather just say, I want to elect a president who's going to make a choice for me. And then
Yeah.
when a president gets elected that they don't trust, right? We go back to that precept, that core idea of trust. Well, I don't trust that president. Now what do I do? I have to make a decision, or I just freak out and say he can't be my president because he's got to make decisions for me so I don't have to. And that's led us to really where we're having a lot of the problems in this country today.
Yeah, and it tends to kind of electrify and amplify politics, right? It makes politics every election cycle life or death because we've decided that the political class in government is going to make most of our choices for us. So
Right.
who's in government now everything is in the balance. And it's interesting when we look at you can analyze this notion of choices and consequences at the individual level than at the larger political level. At the individual level, the old-fashioned way, sort of the classical way, and here I'm gonna bring in an important piece of choices and consequences, and that is shame. Shame was a real thing because typically when you made choices and then if you made bad choices that led to bad consequences,
Hmm.
you were ashamed of yourself and other people would shame you. So the
Right.
classical way would be if you said or did something foolish, you likely would be mocked for your foolishness. If you did or said something ridiculous or outlandish, you likely would be mocked even by your friends for being outlandish or ridiculous. Today, the progressive mindset seems to be that the mockery is the worst thing. It's a terrible thing. The foolishness is not. The ridiculousness is not. So,
Yes.
so right, make any choice that you want to make, but no one dare mock you. No one dare make fun of that. That now has become the sin, right? And so we shame anyone who dares to shame foolishness or ridiculousness or anything like that. When you ratchet that up to a bigger political scale, we now have a nation of people who want to make the worst kind of choice that a person can make, and that is giving power to make choices to people who will suffer no consequences when they're wrong.
Mhm.
And that is, armies of unelected bureaucrats, and say, you people make these choices, but when they're wrong, nothing bad happens to them. In fact, they just get increases in their salary and extra time off and more resources thrown at them when they're wrong. It's the worst way to make a choice conceivable.
You say that, and the first thing that came to my mind, I don't know if while you were down, you saw the new house that Nancy Pelosi built, or
I did
bought.
not.
This lends to that point, right? She's been in government for over half a century, I think, at this
Yep.
point. She's
Yep.
never had a job that produced anything of value to anybody. Although you could make an argument that there are swaths of Americans, there are huge numbers of Americans today who
Mm-hmm.
the very value that they're looking for is somebody to make decisions for them so that they don't
Right.
have to. And
Right.
and that has created this value in being a government official. And anyway, that she bought a house. First of all, she's put all these hardcore progressive ideas in to California and San Francisco, and we've seen the homelessness and everything else. You
Yeah.
you missed it, but she bought a house in Florida, which is arguably the complete opposite of California today, more than any other state in the country, with
Right.
Texas as a close second.
Yep.
And the house cost $25 million. How does a woman who has been in office for her whole
Yeah.
entire life, the only value she's provided is to tell people, I'm going to make decisions for you so you don't
Mm-hmm.
have to. And nobody's cared about the consequences of what those decisions were. Nobody's sat back and said, "Well, I elected Nancy Pelosi, and here's the consequences. Were they good or were they bad?" And it's just shocking to me that somebody who could sit in office and have so many bad consequences from decisions has made so much money that she is now able to buy a $25 million home, and yet she still
Yeah.
saw all the bad consequences of her decisions happening in California, so she decides to move to the freedom of Florida.
Well, there's certainly great irony and hypocrisy in her choice. And, I mentioned before, when we as a nation decide to vest power in the political class to make our choices for us, to regulate our lives, our businesses, our homes, our property, to subsidize most activities, to control what we do,
Mm-hmm.
we are incentivizing all kinds of corruption, because it means for anyone to do anything, they really have to go get permission from the political class, which
Yeah.
often includes either bribing the political class, right, or having direct connections with the political class, supporting their elections, all those kinds of things. In the case of someone like Nancy Pelosi, I think she's just a model of this. If you go back and look at her investment history, she and her husband,
Yeah.
what you will see is just a consistent record, right, where they know that government is controlling virtually everything, entire industries, and they know when big changes are coming up, and that's when they that helps guide their personal investment strategies and choices, because they have information that ordinary people like you and I just don't have. We're not part of the controlling political class.
And as Americans, we've made the choice to not hold them responsible.
Hmm. That's right.
So I think that the general theme of this whole conversation is we need to, as a people, and I'm not even just saying conservatives, but as Americans, remind everybody that this country started as a choice. This country started, and it's interesting. We go back to the case study this month, and for those who haven't seen it yet, it's
Yeah.
it's up on the website. The case study this month was about a group of British subjects who
Hmm.
felt like they were being ostracized for their political beliefs and threatened for their political beliefs in
Yeah.
Britain. So they
And their
made
their religious beliefs.
right, and they decided to up and move to the United States. And the first choice they made was, okay, but our religious beliefs are right. They didn't like them over there, but now we're here and we get to be in charge, and we're going to tell everybody else that they have to follow our religious beliefs. And it's no different than the Syrians and the Jews in 200 BC.
That's a hard lesson for many patriotic Americans to really get their minds around. That we're talking about the Pilgrims and that famous first Thanksgiving. You know, they landed in 1620 there near Plymouth, and half of them didn't even survive the winter. I mean, it was just brutal and
Right.
terrible and lethal. And then they, you know, with the help of some local natives, they figured out how to grow some food and catch some fish and build some huts and things like that. And they had their Thanksgiving. But it's not like these people came to the United States looking for full-blown individual liberty. They were being persecuted in the old country, and they were tired of being persecuted. They wanted to get away from that, understandably.
Sure.
But they were quite happy to set themselves up as the persecutors, which is exactly what it starts to happen in that early Massachusetts colony. And they implement a kind of, really, it's a kind of theocracy that they create under Bradford and the political class there. And it, you know, I used to joke with students all the time that I've had a crush for a decade on Anne Hutchinson. Many people have forgotten who she is, but she was this rebellious, spirited woman in that early Massachusetts colony, and she started pushing back. She was questioning the religious authorities. She didn't necessarily agree with what they were preaching from the pulpit. And she had to be very careful because the punishments were real. You could be imprisoned.
Hmm.
They were doing things like cutting the ears off of people who didn't worship the right way, and they would bore holes in their tongues. I mean, it was barbaric. And so what she started doing was on Sunday afternoons after the church service, she would host these little salons in her house. She would prepare some tea and crumpets, right? That sort of thing. And it was mostly women. She would invite a few of her lady friends over to discuss the morning sermon. What did you think about that? And they would just have, that was it. They would just have a discussion. And the controlling political and religious class there in Massachusetts, they were outraged. They thought, how dare these women, they're not part of the clergy, right? They're not trained in these things. How
Hmm.
dare they just be openly talking about and voicing opinions about these things? And they end up expelling Anne Hutchinson, and she goes off and becomes one of the founders of Rhode Island, the first colony that really adopts full blown religious liberty. She makes that choice. If you're not going to let me speak freely and think freely, then I'm out of here. I'm going to make a choice to go someplace else and start something new.
One could argue that Anne Hutchinson had started the first Vino Veritas Society chapter
I love it. Yes,
400 years ago.
that's right.
Um, well, there's that, but and she knew something else, and I love pointing this out to people, and you might agree with me, you might disagree with me. I'm sure there's going to be some people on this who disagree with me, but the one thing Ann Hutchinson knew is whether you have voting rights or not, whether you're being treated equally in society, and right, and I don't advocate for the unequal treatment of anybody by the law, right? Complete
Right.
equality of treatment, equal application of the law to all people.
Sure.
However, one thing Ann Hutchinson clearly knew that I think a lot of us men realize and maybe don't admit as often as we should, whether they have the rights or not, or whether they have the power or not, women still really run our lives, right? I mean, she knew that if I get these women together, they're going to
Yeah.
go out and they're going to go talk to their husbands, and most of their husbands are going to do whatever their wives say because that's just kind of the nature of relationships.
Well, I mean, you say that a little tongue in cheek, and there's a lot of truth to what you say. Certainly, at the level of individual relationships, women can exercise great amounts of influence and persuasion over the men in their lives. And we see this in some very pointed instances in history leading up to the Civil War. The whole fight over abolition throughout the 1820s and 30s and 40s was primarily a fight among men. Uh,
Hmm.
it was it was men writing in newspapers and fighting in Congress and in state legislatures, and these it was men. And this is exactly what makes Uncle Tom's Cabin,
Harriet Beecher
Harriet
Stowe.
beat Harriet Beecher Stowe, she changed the cultural landscape in America because she started writing. Uncle Tom's Cabin originally was not a book; it was a series of magazine articles in a woman's quarterly magazine. And now all of a sudden, women are reading these accounts of what like is life on the plantation, and large numbers of women start realizing this is they just hadn't thought about it that much. And Uncle Tom's Cabin brings it into their living room. All of a sudden, they're sitting at home realizing this is terrible, this injustice. And she gets large numbers of women interested in this subject. And no less than Abraham Lincoln thinks that is a pivotal moment in building up to the Civil War. Once slavery becomes intolerable to large numbers of women, something's got to be done to bring this institution to an end. So there's a lot of choice, a lot of truth to what you're saying.
What was the famous Lincoln line? She walks into his
You're
office and he says, "So you're the little woman who started this big war."
yeah,
Uh,
that's exactly
I,
it. Yeah,
I also
you know,
go ahead.
I wanted to also offer on this whole subject here of choices and consequence, sort of a deep human framework of this. When you think about it, that activity of making choices and accepting the responsibilities, owning, being responsible for the consequences, whether those consequences are desirable or undesirable. That really is the essence of becoming a mature adult human being. That is what it means to make that transition from being a child where typically, right, when you're a child, someone else is making your choices for you. And as you get a little bit older, typically, right, parents will let a child start making more and more choices. You're practicing how to make little choices on your own. The idea being that when you grow up and you're in a fully independent, mature adult human being, you're going to make your own choices and you're going to own and be responsible for the consequences. And we sure seem to have lost sight of that. That is the goal of maturity, of growing up, is having that freedom to make our own choices and deal with the consequences, whether they're pleasant or unpleasant, desirable or undesirable, rather than thinking, well, when I get older, I'm just going to pick a new set of parents rather than my actual
Right.
parents. When I grow up older, I'll have a bunch of bureaucrats acting like they're my parents and making my choices for me.
It's interesting you talk about dealing with consequences. And when you deal with consequences, that often means making other choices, right? You
Hmm.
something happens, you have a consequence, and now you have to make a choice on how you deal with that in a way. And I think that brings us back to the case study once again. In the case study, we talk about how when the Pilgrims and the Puritans first started those initial colonies, they were very socialist in nature, right? They were communal.
Yeah.
There wasn't a free market system where somebody could say, "Hey, I see that this person needs better wagon wheels, so I'm going to go
Yep.
on my own. I'm going to go out into the woods and I'm going to cut down some trees and I'm going to learn how to work with wood and I'm going to go make new wagon wheels." They had somebody in charge of the community who said, "Okay, you're going to go do this and you're going to go do that and we're
That's right.
going to share everything." And they quickly realized the negative consequences of that decision.
Hmm.
And over time, you started to see this change. You saw Anne go to Rhode Island and start a new colony. So that was a decision
Hmm.
she made to deal with the initial bad decision. And eventually, over 155 years, we went from 1621, where you have this religious socialist regime. I don't know if you could call it a regime, but a community
Yeah.
that eventually worked its way to the ideas of the Declaration of Independence and the founding of this country. And to just think about how drastic a development that is, the number of choices that had to be made along the way, and the number of people who knew how to make good analytical thought and knew how to think through things and really determine those things is a testament to the human ability. When you don't just say whatever somebody chooses for me is going to be my life, whatever people want to do, I want somebody else to make all my decisions. I don't want to have to deal with the consequences of my decisions. I'd rather just live with whatever consequences somebody else makes, that puts people in a bad place. But if people all start making good decisions, I think the creation of America over those 155 years, from the first Thanksgiving to the signing of the Declaration of Independence, is a testament of what good decisions one after another, and teaching people about the past and learning from
Yeah.
history, how powerful that can really be.
It also speaks to the choices that are available to people, the possibility of choices. In a discussion we had with some of our Vino and Veritas Society members, I was pointing out in the context of our case study how geography is kind of an important part of that story. When you think of the old world, you think of life in England. It's a small little island in the North Atlantic, and the supervising, controlling eye of the king and the royal family, and and his legions of barons and dukes. It was everywhere. It was almost impossible to escape it. If you were doing something that was prohibited by the king, by parliament, by the regime, you were going to get discovered sooner or later. And these people pack up and they sail across the Atlantic, and they arrive in what seemed to them at the time was this just infinite, unlimited space. I mean, they didn't even know how far North America, right? They didn't know. It just seemed to go on and on as far as could be. And that opened up a whole lot of new choices. It made it harder for those who wanted to control others. It made it really difficult because the sheer geography of the place, all that open space made it there were now choices for Ann Hutchinson and Roger Williams and those. They could just pack up and head out and go to Rhode Island or head west, go someplace different. And so those choices that are available, people tend to make better choices when they have more options, more choices. It's one of the beautiful things about the notion of individual liberty when people actually have a wide panoply of choices in front of them.
Well, and you did compare it during that conversation. You compared it to, what if they hadn't landed it at in Plymouth and the main
Hmm.
continent, and what if they had landed
Right.
at an island, and what you really end up with is Cuba or the Dominican Republic.
Right. Right.
You get these places, and if Ann Hutchinson, it's not like Ann Hutchinson could have sat there and said, you know what, enough of you guys. I'm going to go get my own boat and I'm going to sail to another island, or I'm going to go.
Right.
That wasn't feasible or reasonable at the time. So
That's right.
what would have happened with the guys who were trying to control that socialist society? They would have put her in jail. They wouldn't have said,
Hmm.
okay, just, I'm going to leave. You guys do what you want. I'm going to leave. She would have been a disruption to them, and they would have put her in jail. And that's still what happens today in these socialist societies. They try to keep you from leaving, and they say, no, you can't go somewhere else
That's
and
right.
tell the world what we're doing. You're going to stay here, and we're going to shut you up one way or another.
The former Secretary of Education under Ronald Reagan, William Bennett, who I had the honor of doing some work with when I was out at the Claremont Institute, he used to have this just wonderful imagery. He would say, if you want to know the character of a nation, think of a wall around it. Whether it's a real wall or an imaginary one, doesn't matter. Just think of the wall and then think of lifting the wall up. When you lift it up, do people run in or do they run out? That kind of tells you everything you need to know about the regime, right? If it's a really bad, unjust, tyrannical regime, they're going to run out. They want to get away. If it's a relatively free, decent place, people are
Hmm.
going to run in. They want to get in. I just want to emphasize this theme cuts really to the heart of what it means to be a human being. I mean, there's many ways to describe a human being. We're a being with a soul. We're a being with a free, rational mind. And that free, rational mind has the capacity to make choices. We are beings who make purposeful, informed, intelligent choices, or at least we have the capacity for it. We can make choices. We're beyond most animals, for example. You could say they kind of make choices in a way, but their choices are driven primarily by instinct and by sensations of pleasure or pain.
Hmm.
I always joke. You can try explaining till you're blue in the face that this pill is good for your dog, that it's going to help your dog, right, feel better, and your dog's not going to take the pill. What do you have to do? You have to appeal to his sense of pleasure. You got to wrap it with cheese or bacon or something, right? You got to make it taste
Right.
good. We human beings, we often do make the choice to take the medicine or have a surgery, right? Something that's painful, that's not pleasant at all, because we know there's some long-term good to it. We choose to do things that are unpleasant in the short term because we perceive some longer term, more important, desirable goal. So that act of making purposeful, intentional, thoughtful choices and accepting, owning, being responsible for the consequences, and then dealing with those consequences is of the essence of being a mature human being. And I think one of the things that we're losing in modern progressive America is that sense of what it means to be an adult, mature human being. Because there's something, it requires some courage. Speaking of sort of all the classical virtues all connect together to really be free to make those choices. We can't be living in a state of panic or fear, right? A person in a state of panic is not really a free person. Their
Hmm.
panic, their fear is gonna drive their choices. To make purposeful choices, thoughtful, sober choices, we need to be calm and collect, which means we need some courage, we need some wisdom, we need some knowledge about the world, we need some experience, and that courage to make our own choices and accept the consequences is one of the things I really worry that we're losing. I think too many people in the United States today look at that and say, well, I'm too scared to make my choices. I'm scared I'll make a bad choice. I'm scared of the consequences. And so I'm happy letting someone else make my choices for me. And in doing that, we're giving up really the most valuable thing we have, which is our freedom, which in many ways is our humanity, our adulthood.
Hmm.
It's like we're choosing to return to a state of childhood is really what modern progressivism is offering to the world. You live as children, and we progressives will make your choices for you.
It's absolutely true. Each word you used in there was so perfect and intentional that we could do probably an entire other podcast on each one of those. And the one that jumped out at me is knowledge. And
Mhm.
I think having a knowledge about the world and being able to trust the information you're getting is so critically important to being able to make good choices and good decisions. The best thing you can do though is start by developing knowledge about how to think.
Mhm.
And that's what we do as guardians. That's what we do. That's what we strive for in the Vino Veritas Society is become knowledgeable about how to think about things, about the reason behind ideas and the foundational ideas that allow you to take all of that and make a good informed decision. I hope people put in the time to continue learning, and we will commit to continue to put in the time to provide as much of that foundational knowledge as we can to continue to guard the American idea.
As we grow, as the influence of the Vino and Veritas Society expands across the United States, one of the consequences will be more people, more Americans living as truly free, self-governing adult human beings and self-governing citizens.
And demanding that their government allow them to, and
That's right.
having expectations that their neighbors do the same.
That's
And
right.
and I think that's how we get to have a better country. I know a lot of people are ready to fight, to pick up their weapons and go fight. But if we're going to do this without a fight, it's going to be through people demanding to be free to make their own
That's
choice,
right.
understanding the consequences of that, of those choices, and knowing how to deal with them when they come along.
That's right.
With that, let's just continue to strive to be better guardians, to guard the American idea.
No sumos custodes, Dave.
Good to see you, Tom. Hope you feel better, and hopefully we'll be back in the studio next week.
Okay.
Have a great week.
You too.